then the other disciple also went in, the one who arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. I'm going to come back later in the talk about the cloth that had covered his head, because some people have questions about what happened to that one, and we'll talk a little bit about that later here. So after Jesus dies and rises, the apostles are left with the crown of thorns, the nails, the linen cloths, and they don't know what to do with them, literally, because you don't walk around with burial cloths with blood on them. That was not something that Jews readily did. In fact, they were considered unclean if they touched any of these things. So what happened to the linen cloth? Well, we have some records back from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries that talks about this image of Edessa. King Akbar actually wrote to Jesus asking him when he had leprosy if he could come and cure him. And instead, Jesus declined the invitation. His ministry wasn't going to take him that far north. And he promised the king to send him one of his apostles after he left Earth by way of messenger. And then Thaddeus the apostle visits bearing a gift, the image not made by human hands, and the king is cured of his leprosy. And there's great conversions in this area in the 1st century because of the image of Edessa. I'll just give you a little map here. So we'll come back to this map a couple of times. So Jesus dies in Jerusalem, and then shortly thereafter, which is Ufra, Turkey today, it doesn't say it very well, but that's Edessa, or Ufra, Turkey today. So it makes its transfer up to there. And it's there for quite a while, for about 5 centuries. And in about the 3rd and 4th century, the people had lost their faith. They weren't practicing Catholicism in any way we would imagine it today. And the people in charge of the image hid it away in the castle in Edessa. And actually it was forgotten. It had been there for a couple of centuries. In the 6th century, when they were being raided by the Persians from the north, they'd rediscover the cloth of Edessa. And if you look in this image from the 6th century, there's this little face of Jesus up there. The cloth that we think is the Shroud of Turin, that's 14 feet long, most of the time in its existence in its 1st century was folded up so all you saw was the face of Jesus. So sometimes people thought this was the cloth of Veronica or some other cloth, didn't realize there was an entire burial shroud behind this face of Jesus. The face of Jesus doesn't look like the one over here. It's the reverse of that. We'll get to that in a moment. But that's what they would see. It's just the face of Jesus. So you have to imagine we don't have any pictures of Jesus, right, from that time frame. We don't have any artist renditions of Jesus or the apostles. So over time, there were lots of different interpretations of what Jesus looked like. But after this discovery in the 6th century, the artist interpretations of Jesus all come to one interpretation, and it is from the image of Edessa. So if you look at the Shroud of Turin on the left, and you compare this coin from 692, you can see they're almost exactly the same. If you look at another coin as well from that same time period, the image on the shroud face, the coin in 692. And then, probably the most famous one, this is in a Syrian church, and this was in 550, about 4 years before that siege in Edessa. And again, we can see that it's a giant on the dome of this church in Syria, a picture of Jesus. So after the Persians raid here, it is believed that the Shroud of Turin went to Constantinople. It was part of the great Eastern Church at that time, Istanbul today. And a great church was there, and they kept it there for a while, the Knights Templar, and then they moved it down through Athens, and then eventually it comes all the way up to Lourdes, France in 1353, the top point there. It's owned at that time by the Knights Templar and the House of Savoy, which was the royalty there. They brought it down to Chambray a century later in 1453, and then in 1578 it's transferred to Turin. And it's transferred to Turin, interestingly, any of you heard of Charles Borromeo? Charles Borromeo? He was the Archbishop at the time of Milan, which is where the Turin diocese is under. And he wanted to see the Shroud of Turin. But they were afraid at that time in the 16th century for him to travel across the Alps and go to Chambray, France. So instead, they brought the Shroud of Turin to him. And it's been there ever since, 1578. Now, everybody in Italy, or that part of Italy, knew about the Shroud of Turin. John Bosco knew about the Shroud of Turin. He was a great devotee to the Shroud of Turin. and many other saints and blessed and other people came to Turin to see the Shroud of Turin. And they would bring it out from time to time, or they'd let you into the special chapel. It was kept in a small silver box, and they'd bring it out for special, mostly private exhibits. They did bring it out sometimes when kings were crowned. So there's so many relics in the church that this wasn't considered at that time in the 19th century, again, before we had all the electronic communication we have today, to be anything really out of the ordinary, that a church had a relic of Jesus in it, or had some saint relic in it. But then, in 1898, they were going to have the first public exposition of the Shroud of Turin because of the 300 years that it had been in Turin, I believe it was. We'll have a slide on that in a moment. So Seconda Pia, who's an attorney, asks for permission and gets permission to take a picture of the Shroud of Turin. And he took it with this camera right here. Just to give you an idea how big the camera is, it's in one of the museums there. That's not a small camera. Okay? That's the size of the camera he used. And he literally set up, they put the shroud up where you're going to see it, and he stood back about this far away, and he started snapping pictures. Well, not snapping pictures, because that was a long process. Any of you have ever been around, not the priests, I know they probably know about this, and you probably know about this, but you know what film is? What a film camera is? Okay, when I took pictures I was your age, like 40 years ago, you take a camera and a roll of film, you get 12 or 14, 24 prints. You take a picture, you send it off, and you get back the image that you took and the negatives. So you got both. And if you wanted to reprint, you had to use the negatives because the prints came off the negatives. So in 1898, Seconda Pia is going to take a picture for the first time. And he goes back into his developing studio in Turin, takes the plate out, and goes to develop it. And in the first bath, he's expecting this negative image to come out. But for all you math majors out there, a negative of a negative is very good. And that's what he sees. He doesn't see the negative image, he sees this positive image. And he almost drops the plate on the floor and says, "My God, I'm looking at my God's face." And this is the actual picture. It's a little more grainy than some of the ones that have been taken since, but that is the face of Jesus. Not as you see on the Shroud of Turin, but when you take a picture of the negative image. This is what you will see when you see the Shroud of Turin. And the face is kind of hard to see in this display here, is right here. That's Jesus' face. That gives you the dimensions of the Shroud of Turin. I'm just going to run through a few of these so you get a little bit more familiarity with it. This is if we took just the front of Jesus, the front side, again you can see his head at the top, his arms here with the blood stain. These marks, you see these triangles, are from a fire. Actually, the shroud's been through 3 fires, and it affects some of the ability to test it. We'll talk about that in a moment. But that's what it looks like in the front. But this is the negative image of the negative image. So you can see it's much more clear when you look at it after you've taken a picture of it with the film camera. A lot of the detail came out. So again, what they would see when they see the shroud is sort of a faint image, kind of ghostly almost. But when you take a picture of it and you reverse it, that's what it looks like. Here's the back of Jesus. Can't see much. But if we go to the negative image, again, you can see all the scourge marks, the crown of thorns at the top, all the marks on his legs from the whipping and the scourging that took place. So, 1898, the king asked for this public exhibition, and the one you're going to is only the 5th one since then. So there was one in 1978 for the 400th year of being in Turin. That came there in 1578. That was the one that John Paul II was at. 1998, they had one for the 500th anniversary of the cathedral. 2 years later, that went so well, they decided to have one for the Jubilee of the birth of Jesus Christ. And then when I went 5 years ago, it was because the cardinal was retiring, and he requested, the archbishop, who was a cardinal, asked to have an exposition for his retirement, and Pope Benedict agreed to that, and he went to see it at that time. And then 2015, Pope Francis said, "You know what, I'd really like to see the Shroud of Turin." So they said, "Okay, we'll have another exposition." So, and also Milan's having a World's Fair, so they're worried everybody's going to go to Milan and not come to Turin. There's a lot of rivalry between the two places. So, the next scheduled one is 2025, which is another Jubilee year in the church. And that's what I thought would be the next time I'd get a chance to see it. So in 1898, Segundo takes this picture, and of course, they're like, oh, it's a fake. Somebody came up with this. This is not the real thing. It goes along like that for quite a while. But then in 1930s, another photographer takes pictures, gets the same results. So then they start thinking about it more seriously, and then there's this battle as the House of Boy transfers the image to the papal authorities, the Pope, and whatever they call that. They're the owners of, the Vatican is now the owner of the Shroud of Turin, not the House of Savoy. And they decided, hey, let's do some scientific investigation work. And there was quite a tug of war. We just saw a video on this last night where there were some just saying, we're not going to test the burial cloth of Christ. If it is the burial cloth of Christ, that would be a sacrilege. And the other side, the Vatican was saying, well, if we don't test it, they're going to say it's a fake. And we don't want to venerate a fake. So how do we resolve this? So they decided in 1978 to allow the first scientific testing of the Shroud of Turin. They weren't allowed to cut away anything, but they were allowed to do pretty much anything that would not involve any damage to the shroud. And they did an extensive testing in October of 1978. They tested for pollen, they tested for blood, they tested for the image where it was on the linen threads. And one of the more interesting things they said, because everybody says, well, it was a painting. Well, it can't be a painting because a painting would absorb all the way through the linen cloth. And it's only the very, very top microfibers of the linen, individual threads, where there's sort of a scorch mark on top. That's the best description I've come up with. I'm reading all about this. And they found no image on the back of the shroud. The blood did go through those threads in those places, but they didn't see an image on the other side of the cloth. So again, a scorch mark on one side, blood going through the entire rest of the linen cloth. If you've got questions, I know I talk pretty fast, so raise your hand and jump in. I might be happy to answer while we're going along here. I can certainly answer questions at the end. Let's talk about what wounds we can see on the Shroud of Turin. Probably the most prominent ones, you can see it in this picture as well, are the blood marks from the shroud, the crown of thorns. The crown, when you think about the crown of thorns, I always used to think about a rose bush and a thorn about that long. But that's how long the thorns were that were shoved into our Savior's head. Were very, very long, very, very sharp. And of a pollen of a thorn plant that grows in desert areas near Palestine were found on the shroud. So again, if it's a fake from the Middle Ages, we'll get to that in a moment, that forger had to somehow get that linen cloth down to Palestine to put that pollen on there. And they also found pollen from Edessa, from plants that only grow in Edessa, from plants that only grow in Constantinople, from plants that only grow in Athens. So the forger, before we even knew about microscopes and pollen, had to put pollen on that linen cloth from those areas. And a couple of plants are extinct. So it makes it real complicated for a modern forger to get that stuff on there because you wouldn't be able to find it anymore. And actually, in looking at the shroud from a forensic standpoint, we know it's not a crown of thorn, but it's actually a cap of thorns that was placed on Jesus' head. They also were able to discover that it was AB negative male blood. They were able to get enough off the shroud and be able to test that. And this is where my medical knowledge goes kind of blank, but cellular and serous component separation had taken place. Basically, it means the blood on the shroud was for somebody who had died. And it leaves a certain kind of chemical mark on the shroud. So it wasn't somebody who was alive and they put this cloth on and they faked all these injuries and they pulled it off. No, that man was dead. He was crucified. Whoever was in that cloth, there's pretty good consensus, had to be killed, had to be crucified. We can see the blood wounds on Jesus' wrists here. These are his hands folded over, I guess this way. And you can notice where the blood marks are. It's actually not as in the palm of your hands, it's lower. It's not, it may touch a little bit of the palm and may go in this way, but it's actually more on the wrist. And the reason for that is when the Romans crucified people, they put the nail here, you just have that fleshy part, it would have ripped right out. So they knew to put it through the bone and between the wrists. And when you do that, a certain thing happens. The thumb gets pulled under the hand. You lose the tendon in there. And so if you're crucified, you lose the use of your thumbs. And that's depicted in the shroud picture, as you can see. We don't see Jesus' thumbs at all. That's due to the traumatic shock. Also, when you think about him being nailed, these are about 6 inches long. So they're huge spikes. They're not like a 10-penny nail. And Jerry Richter was here early. He does a great job on the scourging of Jesus from the Passion of the Christ movie, and went through that really well. And he has made a